can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show's support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with me, Mark Carroll. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Timothy Jones, who is currently Head of Coach Education and Development at 24/7 UK Soccer Academy in the USA. It's absolutely brilliant to have you here, Tim. It's partly just to catch up a little bit, but also because we can talk coach development, and I think as much as I love talking about coaching, that next stage is so interesting. So, firstly, how are you, Tim? Have you been okay?
Doing very well, thanks. Yeah, I can't complain. Now the sunshine is a regular thing here again in California, and certainly enjoying being here.
And without making me jealous instantly, That is a good place to start, actually, because you aren't half collecting stamps on that passport of yours. It might be useful for those that are listening if you can maybe tell us a little bit about where you currently are and what you're currently doing, but maybe a little bit about your coaching journey to date, or coach developer journey to date, because you've coached in something like 6 different countries, different continents, which is just an amazing experience, first and foremost, before we got on to talking about now your research and other things like that. So yeah, tell us about that coaching journey.
I'll try and do the abridged version. I'm from Jersey in the Channel Islands. That's where I was born, and so grew up with the game mainly through my older brother. This is all his fault that I'm involved in this area of the world and area of coaching. He actually was my under-18s coach for a couple of years. After that, I went to college actually to do music. My other sort of love was music. Studied for that and spent too much time playing football and other sports rather than concentrating on my degree. So that probably told me a fair bit. Went back to Jersey, volunteer coaching. I took an adult ladies team and a young girls team for a couple of years. Was very successful with that, and sort of thought, right, well, this might actually be a career here. And applied for a job in the States, in New Jersey. It was supposed to be for a summer contract, and they offered me a 9-month contract. And that's kind of where it all began. The rest is history. Went over there, spent 2 and a bit years coaching in New Jersey. So it was my first experience of the US and the US system. From that, decided, now I'm going to take this really seriously now. And went to the University of South Wales. Took the football coaching degree there, actually stayed there for 5 to 6 years, did my master's there as well. And during that time, coached in a number of different places in South Wales, London, Bristol. And that was when I first was involved in an academy system. I was a coach at Bristol Rovers in the foundation phase. I also took the ladies team at the university, and again was successful with that. So that was my first experience of sort of a college, university team experience. And then from that, kind of left it all behind to go to Saudi Arabia, as you do, working for Arsenal initially, and then that transferred over to Juventus. So I was a technical director there, and obviously coaching within sort of compounds areas, completely different culture, British coach working for an Italian club in the Middle East. There's a big mix of stuff there. And then following that, went back out to the States, to South Carolina, working as a technical director there. when that slightly imploded, largely due to COVID, that was when I then decided to continue my academic career and moved to Stirling. Met you, was starting my PhD there, eventually took over the ladies women's team in the SWPL2, and again Bucks. Spent a couple of years there and made my way over here to California to take a job where, you know, I'm very fortunate that half my job is coach education and development. As you said, I'm head of with another colleague. You know, we have put the system together from scratch. And then half my job is coaching. And it is important to me to still sort of be at the coalface, as it were. So that's a brief summary.
As brief as I think it can be, actually. and again, I mean, that so does resonate with me, that need to be at the coalface, as you say. Like, as much as it's not to say you can't do great coach development or education, I know that we're going to talk a little bit the language that perhaps I'm using there, because it's becoming more and more interchangeable, but the ability to, you know, empathize often with people and what they're going through, and even to give examples and context, that's something that you certainly would benefit from if you're still in the thick of it, in that sense. But I mean, that it's such an interesting kind of journey, and just your resume in general there. And it's one that I think so many coaches now are aspiring towards. I mean, the amount of young guys and women that I meet, that they want to firstly crack that market in the USA. A lot of them, you know, that's a big place to go to, and it's somewhere that excites a lot of people. But you're also seeing now more and more, and it's become more and more accessible through the sort of partnership that professional, you know, football clubs. This is for soccer, for anyone that's watching. That's Tim's sort of sport, where they have, you know, like community coaches who are working inside different clubs, affiliate clubs across the world now, and it's become more and more accessible. But how did you find actually accessing that market as you went? Because that's something in itself that can be really useful for people that they're trying to get there. Is it the case of just taking that leap? But how do you then turn one job abroad into two jobs, three? You know, it seems like it's a bit of a lifestyle, but there is a bit of strategy behind it, I assume.
Yeah, looking back at it, I don't know how much strategy was involved, but
No.
you know, moving to the US, I do encourage young coaches to seek out something along those lines, and the main reason is that the hours you spend on the field with, you know, I mean, I had at one point I had 8 teams that I was working with, and you can imagine, you know, what your coaching life looks like as a result of that. But as a young coach, you know, level 1, level 2, had been coaching 2 or 3 years. The acceleration to my experience, my ability, my reflections was massive. And that was when I first moved to New Jersey with a company that was called UK Elite. It's now called Steel Soccer. They got taken over by a conglomerate called Steel Sports. And, you know, just so grateful for that opportunity. In terms of, you know, what the strategy was, just looked online, found the company online, simply looked for coaching companies. This one came up as UK Elite. Applied, as I say, you know, I intended and expected to be offered a 2-month contract, and was offered more. I had to travel over to Loughborough in the UK, so I literally took a flight and a train to get there and do the interview. And then it's, you know, qualifications for me, you know, not being an ex-pro, I was very aware very quickly that I didn't have that to fall back on. So, you know, started the coaching license pathways. I have licenses with the FA, FAW, currently with the SFA. I did NSCAA, which is not a thing anymore in the US. So I don't know how useful that one is anymore. LMA, and then, of course, you know, degrees. And, you know, a lot of the youngsters I'm involved with now, I say youngsters, they're in their 20s, you know, they're doing their bachelors, they're doing their masters, they are trying to upskill in that way. But interestingly enough, we had a conversation in one of our coach development sessions recently where Harry Redknapp was talking about coaches in academies and how they're just academics now. You know, they're 23, 24, they haven't played the game, and the sort of laptop coaches is the phrase that gets kind of levied at them. And over my time, the qualifications and education has been so important. And certainly my application to my role in Saudi Arabia, yes, my work in academies in Bristol Rovers, Monmouth, during my time in Wales, experience was important, but being backed up by that qualification level and being able to talk about it did help in terms of taking on a role where I would be managing and looking after others.
Mm, mm. And it's yeah, and I suppose that I think the backlash to some of the comments that you'd mentioned from Harry Redknapp, I think that's probably testament to the fact I think nowadays people are more aware that coaches come from all sorts of different backgrounds, and it's the diversity that's amazing, because we all have a certain thing that we bring. Some coaches bring their previous athletic achievements, and that's brilliant, and that allows them to access certain spaces that we might otherwise struggle to do. But other coaches now come from more academic roots, and they also bring a vision, if it's an appreciation for different frameworks and ways of seeing things, and evidence base that in itself is also extremely valuable. And then you've got the coaches who do neither of those things, but or at least maybe doesn't necessarily rely on either of those things, but brings with them just pure time in the trenches, just pure time on the park, and they've got that real experiential sort of knowledge, and it's all great. It's all great. I'm quite intrigued. You'd mentioned about just the acceleration in your development over probably what was quite a short time. Maybe not now. It doesn't seem like it's a short time scale, but you probably developed far quicker in a shorter time through just the exposure to these different environments, one after another. What do you think it was in particular around that? And again, this doesn't speak for everyone. It's for you as an individual, but we all end up having similar experiences, and maybe we can take things from that. What do you think what aspects of your development do you think really did accelerate? Is it to do with working with different cultures? Is it to do with the fact that you've got accreditations across different governing bodies, like in different associations? That's like, is there differences there, or is there a universal language that you've now found within coaching based on being in different governing bodies and doing different awards and stuff like that? I'm quite interested if you can speak to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Initially, that spending time on the grass with different teams, different abilities in a different culture, the main thing that I had to develop a much better sense of was session and practice design. I knew that I'd be moving from, I'm working with an under 14s top team, girls, and then 5 minutes later, I'm with an under 9s boys team that are rec level, right? So they're several teams down in terms of that club.
Mm-hmm.
So it's being able to transition between those things so quickly. Preparation had to be better than what I'd experienced before, because I had one team, 2 sessions a week. I had all week to thinking about it. But that was certainly something that progressed for me very, very quickly, in combination then with some online education that helped. And I went out and sought that. And as I spoke before about, being aware that I'm not an ex-pro, there was a website called Inside Soccer many years ago. It doesn't exist anymore, but they had these videos of pros going through their technique. I remember some of them so vividly, of like Paolo Maldini, Beckenbauer was on it and speaking, and just soaking that up, because it was information that I hadn't come across before. But I think that that's natural, that if you want to do really well in what you're doing, then you're going to go and seek that information. And I was, very lucky that that was available at the time. So that answers the first part of your question, I think. In terms of, coach education, my experience of it, going across those different pathways, I did the FA Youth modules and the Youth Award whilst I was at Bristol Rovers. At the same time, I was doing my B license with the FAW. There are slight changes in language and approach, as you would expect. I think there almost has to be, so that you feel kind of uniquely connected and involved, right, with that national governing body. But just as you would have in a club, usually now it's 2 years or so that you spend with a team before someone else comes in. The reasoning behind that being you're getting a different voice, different language, different behaviors. Now the kids have to assimilate to that rather than becoming comfortable. I think that's really helped me, that I had these uncomfortable experiences of I need to learn a new language, a new way of being, and I almost need to, dare I say it, because it comes with some other issues that maybe we'll discuss, but conform to those environments. And as a younger coach, and I mean, again, we can talk about the differences between what assessment looks like and what the actual coaching job looks like. But I don't see it as a negative. It was certainly helpful to do that. And I'm about to embark on basically the same thing, where I'm going to need to take my USSF licenses here. That all comes with a different language and different way of being. So, I mean, just have to approach that with excitement, I think.
I think that's the one thing you said there. I actually think that is a real skill. See conformity. I know we're doing this, and I'm going to say this with an asterisk attached to it. We do want innovation and these things. Sounds like from your coaching journey, the fact you've had to be in a lot of different spaces and places. The first part of anything of being able to have any impact somewhere is that you do need to assimilate to some extent to where you're at, and it might not even necessarily be that we're moving around, and it's not that this is only applicable to people on different continents from one year to the next. It can be even within their own local environment, from coaching kids to more senior players to coaching boys to girls to being in different coaching partners. We do need to be good as coaches at fitting with the brief, because then that to some extent as a starting point can allow you to then understand your environment and where from there you can make improvements. And I do say that with a real emphasis on how you can make improvements. I don't think it's about how we should stay like everyone else, and I think that's maybe a conversation we can get into a bit later on in this conversation about coach development.
Right.
But that is a skill.
As a coach, though, I can certainly speak to that. I mean, one of the major experiences for me was going from Bristol Rovers, that was very much a games-based academy system, especially in foundation phase, where literally everything was games-based opposed. To then move over to Saudi Arabia to work for Arsenal, who said, we are games-based. I mean, it was just a brilliant, very comfortable move that allowed me to then figure out my place in a very different culture, and obviously, experience new kids, new families, etc. When we moved to Juventus, the Juve curriculum was much more technical based, much more physical based, and a lot of unopposed work, I guess, as you would sort of expect from an Italian club. And it was a nightmare, frankly, for the first couple of months, because these kids were so used to us doing games-based approaches, lots of fun, lots of empowerment, lots of autonomy, to go there, do this at this time in this way. And so, yeah, I had the heat as well. And it was a real struggle. But the kids adapted, we adapted, and we certainly saw improvements. It opened my mind up to, is there a spectrum? Is there a continuum of coaching delivery? And how much can we just conform to, one style over another? And certainly, as you say, we can get into that in terms of coach development, but how much of it is designed to be reproduction, or how much is it designed to be a little bit more learner-centered and allow coaches to figure out their own way? Therein lies the biggest problem, I think.
No, you're absolutely correct. And sometimes it's even just, it might be the same at its core, the same methodology that you're going into, but where there's a language change. And I don't mean literally like that, the native language. I mean that sometimes the words that we attach to mean the same thing. Where I've spent some time in Spain recently, and they might call a more sort of drill-based, unopposed practice the sort of analytical approach to coaching, whereas we might call that a drill or something that's a skill-based activity, and it might seem like just semantics, but that in itself does bring with it certain connotations as to what you should be looking at, what perhaps where perhaps you plan from, in terms of what the emphasis then is put on and within that, and they're all just experiences that you need to gain through, as I say, going to different environments. Again, it can be local, or it could be across the pond. I'm quite interested to know, you spoke a little bit about adapting to different players, but maybe this is a good segue onto today's conversation, which is about coaches and coach development. What has it been like adapting? Because you worked as a coach developer, am I right, as well, Tim, across different countries? So what's it like adapting within different coach developer cultures? So think about it in that sense. Is there, I'm not expecting you to say there's lots of differences, maybe there isn't, but what's that been like? It'd be interesting to hear about.
One of the funny things about this is that there is continuity in terms of who I've worked with as a coach developer, because largely it's been British coaches, despite the fact that I've been, in the US several times in different states, in Saudi Arabia, London, Wales, they're all British coaches. Now, I have worked with coaches from other cultures and other places for sure, but predominantly it has been British coaches coming with, their own ideas of what the game is, their own development experiences already, and therefore, how they think about coaching and what it looks like, and the language that they used, as you mentioned. So the differences then become, well, what's the context? So, as an example, one of my first coach development experiences was as head of coaching for a charity called Football Beyond Borders, who operate in London. Again, super grateful that I got that opportunity to do that. I was there for about a year and a half, living in Wales, working partly in London, partly in Bristol, partly in Wales. That was a challenge. But the delivery of development for them was based on, well, this program of football is designed for life skill development, developing social cohesion, social development, emotional development for kids who, typically speaking, don't have opportunities in the same way. That being said, we had a really wide range of ability as well then, that we had some kids who, were academy, either currently or not just left, and all the way down to, I just really enjoy football, but it's not something that I do regularly. So again, how do you help coaches then with such a diverse range of kids, and to use their field-based time, because they did classroom time as well, but their field-based time in a way that develops social emotional skills, psychological skills as the focus, rather than what I was experiencing in my other environments of, predominantly tac and physical. So that was such a big challenge so quickly. And, I learned a lot from the directors of the charity, some of the things that they use. So, for example, CASEL, which I've used multiple times across all of my coach development since. That's a social emotional learning collaborative. They have a wheel that looks at social emotional competencies. And that actually became then later the focus of my master's dissertation, which was what do academy coaches think about social development in terms of their young players, and then how they do it. And so you can see the influence then of my job role influenced then how I was looking in terms of research. And that's continued, right? Because my PhD is now research into the coach developer, which is, a role that I do. So it depends on context. I'm then out in Saudi Arabia working with very closely with 3 other coaches. So there's 4 coaches across 3 programs. And you are living and working with these people whilst also trying to manage them and the programs. And that presents a very different challenge, because you're trying to be close friends with these people, which I thankfully, I think, managed to do. They can say otherwise, perhaps. But you're very aware that, okay, I'm going to observe a session, or I need to have a conversation with this person. And then we're going to go have dinner and I'll be sharing a flat with them when I get home later on. So it colors the different ways in which you can speak with these people and work with them. It's super challenging. But what's interesting about that, is that I wasn't required to do coach development. And this is really on reflection that I look back at several of my roles, I decided to. When I was in place as a technical director or as a manager, I didn't have to do that, but I wanted to, and I wanted to work with these people and develop them as much as I could, but also selfishly keep developing myself as a coach developer as well.
It's a really cool point that you say about that, because nowadays, and this is maybe is one point we can start to talk towards your recent study, is the way that we're deliberate in the use of the term coach developer now, because that has had to be used as an umbrella term to mean a whole lot of different things, and more we see, if it's not been necessarily the emergence of it, it's probably just been more the recognition of it. It's probably been that this has been the case for a while, but that coach developers don't just exist in national governing bodies. We have now, what is the terminology used? Personal learning coach, or we don't even need to get as technical as that. Someone you work with, and who it could have a formal role in your development. That is part of the remit, but indeed they might not as well, and it's maybe that more experienced coach, or perhaps a coaching partner. And it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned about some of the tensions. Then, if you decide to do that as a channel for your own development, and again, sometimes I actually would encourage coaches not to always look towards what's the next coaching badge, but instead, actually, how can I spread out my own repertoire of skills beyond his. We do always know that a lot of coaching badges are still about the technical and the tactical, and part of like leadership roles is around sometimes, are you taking more ownership for helping those around you and develop through that? But that comes with differences, doesn't it? In the way that you'd mentioned that the way that you educated and developed coaches in a more formalized, removed role, where you don't need to see them the next day, can impact perhaps what you're like, how you act with them, versus this is a day-to-day mentorship, sort of probably like a reciprocal collaboration at times as well. It just depends, who you're working with, where they're at, are they near you in their own journey, and it's more the synergy of one another, or is it actually indeed someone that you are trying to really give more classical mentorship to and bring it up? So what were some of the tensions within that then, between being the more removed coach educator to being more on the ground as a mentor / critical friend, the way that we all encounter coach developers in our own context?
Yeah, it's a good question. It certainly helps me to think in terms of the coach developer framework from the ICCE, which was 2014. I believe there's a new one on the horizon. Very much looking forward to it, but that's the one we refer to for now. Thinking about those different learning situations and between sort of mediated and unmediated learning, and they make the point really clearly and visually that unmediated learning, informal learning, is a large chunk of how a coach develops. So, I mean, me speaking earlier about accessing a website to learn as much about the technical and tactical aspects of the game as I could at the time. That's an unmediated, informal learning situation. What I think about, especially in terms of my current role, but also in past experiences, is it a formal learning situation in terms of coaching licenses, formal coach ed, degrees, thinking about sort of classroom-based stuff, or is it non-formal? And this is just a more mentoring relationship, as you mentioned before, the sort of personal learning coach. So it certainly helps to just kind of compartmentalize in that way. But the reason I sort of speak in those terms is just to add some clarity to it.
Mm-hmm.
That moving between these spaces, it's helpful, certainly personally anyway, to be like, okay, what hat do I have on? Is this a formal situation? Is it a non-formal? or am I just, having an informal conversation that it just so happens this person is happy to speak to me about? Also then reading and writing myself into the social context as much as I can, and certainly with varying degrees of success, in order to influence in a positive fashion, at least to my own mind. And I've certainly struggled with, at times, doing that effectively. And I guess what I would call flattening the hierarchy, and some of my participants in the research that I'm doing have spoken about this in various different ways, in terms of, I don't want to be on a pedestal. I don't want to be viewed as someone who is, I guess the phrase is more knowledgeable other. I like some aspects of that, but it's that immediate problem with power. If I don't want to be seen to or felt by you as exercising power. And part of the problem when you're then trying to work with coach learners is that they will do various things to maintain that appearance, even though you are saying, I don't want that. This is a reciprocal thing. And it can take a long time. So, especially with mentoring relationships, non-formal relationships, I wonder if often in systems there isn't long enough to develop that relationship. You need time to get to a place where that person in front of you now feels comfortable enough to experience you as a helper rather than as someone who is telling you what to do. And I say that with a, tongue in cheek, because I'm very aware of several situations over the last 10 years where I've either been fantastic with that and achieved that really well, and certainly others where I've had to sit and wear it, that it hasn't gone well, and that I really need to change my approach.
But I mean, yeah, and I suppose there's two things that we can talk to there. There's, you mentioned about the idea of how you navigate the power issue that's always going to be there, and even when we attempt to flatten the hierarchy, that sort of that intention, when it actually meets the candidate who's in front of you, or indeed even the colleague, depending on if it's in a formal or less formal setting, just by the very fact that you are there and that you are even implicitly communicating a desire to help develop someone's practice, them, by accepting that, if they do indeed accept that, and there's a whole other reason for why they may or may not want to, but part of that conversation requires us to exercise a certain level of expertise, and more often than not, it's based on discovering something that has to be fixed. And I always think about that, because I always wonder about what is the true, or if not what's the true, what's the more multifaceted purpose of coach development, because we always see things in a sort of deficit fashion of there's something that we need to fix and something we need to get better at. But by extension of you often saying that here is an aspect of your practice that can improve, we sometimes remove, I think, if not agency, the confidence that comes with knowing that you're doing okay. And I think a lot of coach development is set up in a way to sometimes nullify the view of what you're doing is good, and sometimes indeed it can jump. Sometimes for coaches it's just what's good enough before we even think about getting onto what's effective and what's more effective. You think about that, the parent coach has just started, and you guys are just trying to kind of keep going, and women are just trying to get sessions on for their kids, and these people sit at the foot of a pyramid that is so dependent on them. But again, we're still telling them about improving practice, and again, there's reasons for that, and that can be useful. But it does bring with it all these complexities, as I say, about when you're seen as the expert, you need to do things in order to maintain a level of credibility as expert, which can be counterproductive to a lot of other agendas that we sometimes want to posit within coach development, like the idea of wanting to be inspiring creativity and thinking outside of the box, where at the same time we will still say that here's something you can think about, and therefore that's about trying to put people back in a box. And whether or not we intend for that or not, that's reproduction of knowledge, and this might be something that we can maybe retrace our steps a little bit on, because there's so many things, and I'm taking this, I'm stealing this. This is your patter from a lot of your stuff and your studies. So I don't want people to think this is me. This is because I've been reading about your work, Tim. So let's maybe introduce the listeners to that a little bit more, and then we can come back to it and we can kind of work through all of that, because it is a conundrum. And that's before we then talk about trying to disrupt, people's schemas about, looking at things from a social or a psychosocial perspective and all those different things. There's a whole lot to that we can go into. So you done a systematic review that came out last year. And that systematic review had 3 questions around the coach developer. It was, who is the coach developer? What does the coach developer do, and how does the coach developer operate? So can you kind of talk to us, firstly, what motivated you to do that work, this systematic review, and then we can kind of get into what you done and then what you uncovered, and we can speak through those 2 themes, because it's a very novel piece of work. There hasn't actually been, as much as we like to think that coaching is this really developed practice, we're very much, compared to education, other health research, we're still very much in our infancy. And I just wonder that, because this is filling such a gap, what motivated you? How did you identify that gap? Where's this all came from?
Yeah, thank you. It was partly at the direction of my supervisors for my PhD. That's certainly an influence on it. But as you rightly say, it was a gap. It still is a gap, realistically. And my life as a PhD researcher would have been much easier if a systematic review on this stuff and other systematic reviews in other ways, looking at it from different approaches, already existed, because then I can just read those and I can assimilate knowledge from that and so on. So that would have been much the easier route. There's many a time that I was, sat in my flat in Scotland and, writing for the entire day that I wished someone else was doing the job. But the main motivation was, okay, how can we, as a collective of academics in this area, bring together our understanding of what a coach developer is? And certainly part of the motivation as well was that in my own roles, in my own experiences, that I had some frustrations with how coach developers have been, either me then as a coach learner learning from them, and the frustrations with either the coach developer directly or my understanding of their limitations, or then me as a coach developer and experiencing exactly the same limitations. I mean, like, well, this isn't quite where we want to be on it. So what are the reasons for why we're not there? So, talking about, for example, learner-centered teaching strategies, which a lot of people seem to agree is the way to go forwards with formal coach education. That's all well and good, but as I say in the paper, then people say, well, it's not a panacea, it's not the be-all and end-all, but we want to move closer to it. Okay, if we're going to do that, then what are we providing around the coach developer in order to achieve it? And certainly with vast national governing bodies trying to achieve some form of fidelity for their coach learners, trying to have them have at least similar experiences. That's a huge challenge. And no wonder then that we're not really getting to achieve that, if indeed it's at all possible ever. But in terms of the interest in it, it's how to bring it all together, how to talk about this stuff with some clarity, and then to uncover, where those gaps are. And obviously the self-interest in that is then that with my research and with future papers, I can then start to address some of those gaps that we had identified. And it's pleasing to see that, I have a couple of citations from others, but more importantly that, there are other publications that seem to be addressing these gaps already. There's a book that has just come out. I forget what the name exactly of the publisher is, but addresses so much of what I spoke about in the systematic review. So lots of really, really good research being done, and more importantly, in terms of just the interest in my research in general was there are really good coach developers out there doing really good work. We don't know enough about it. So let's go find out what the best of it is.
So I suppose in terms of the work that you looked at, so I think it dates from 2010 all the way through to 2001. However, there's been a bit of an increase in work probably since 2001, but this is still you've caught quite a lot of work, and this has came at a period, isn't it? If I'm correct, where we've had a bit of a boom in the amount of work that's since started to take off. Looking at coach developer science and the sort of not even necessarily science, but the experiences around that. So you looked at some work around that. And if we can maybe first start from some of the trends in the work itself, because some of the things that intrigued me, and again, I think this might be useful for learners, because it's important to understand where recommendations that maybe has been taken from research, where the research that's given out the recommendations, the trends of that work. So thinking about the fact that most of the studies that have been done to date around coach development are qualitative in nature, meaning they're sort of interview based. Most of the studies you've said are noticeably coaches, where most of the coach educators are male, they're not female. That way, which again speaks to sometimes wider issues around just the pool of coach educator developers. I still need to get right with that word. Or even the very fact that the UK is actually a dominant setting, and then within that, football or soccer is one of the more practiced areas that you'd found that we have these conversations within. Why does any of the stuff I've just said there matter? Because I have a feeling around this, but I'd like to hear it from you. Why is it useful for us to think first about where we're getting our information from, and what is a very novel field still, and it's something up until now we're just needing to go off of feel and professional practice, which is good, but we know we can be better, so we still need to be careful nonetheless about how we integrate knowledge and by appreciating where that knowledge comes from. It's really useful. So why am I saying any of this? Pretty much.
I mean, it's just such an interesting thing to have come across from having done the systematic review. It's like, okay, once we actually start to put a little bit of the stats together from those 50 plus papers, where are they being done? Who with what lens? And seeing, understandably, some common trends in that. And I think that one of the main reasons for example, mainly male participants, mainly in soccer, is that those are where the research is being done and offered and supported, financed, influenced, all of those things. I don't think we can look at those stats and point to it and go, well, no more should be done in that environment. More so that, well, we need more from a wider perspective. And I think it was Calorie and Geraghty who'd spoken about, worldwide problems with coach development during COVID. That in and of itself, okay, lens was the COVID complications. But it certainly pointed to there is so much work being done in this space worldwide that there's so much to learn from each other in that respect. As we spoke about before, only in my little world and silo of experience, the differences in being in different cultures, having to do coach development in different ways, doing it for different national governing bodies, and therefore having to adhere to certain policies. That's just my experience. And there's, hundreds, thousands of people doing this work. So what does it look like? How can we start pointing towards what some effectiveness might be? And I'm very aware that even in my research right now, it is qualitative. So you can't say for certain, I haven't gone and seen any of my participants delivering. You're taking it from their opinions. But they are the experts on the ground doing this work. So there is something to learn from them, especially about what is the best of what is. So to go back to what you were saying, there is another gap, not just in terms of what the coach developer is, who they are, what they do, how they do it, but also what does this look like across a much wider perspective? And as you mentioned, how do we get more female coach developers in place? I think that some of the initiatives, I mostly speak to football, of course, because it's my world. But some of the initiatives over the last few years of female-only licenses has certainly helped. But how do we get to a place where more people are able to access a pathway of becoming a coach developer and then appropriately trained to do that job in an effective way?
Well, we can maybe, it'd be cool to touch on that, and because one of the things you actually cover in the paper is about pathways to coach development. It paints quite a kind of rosy view of why people perhaps get into the role, and I'm wondering maybe there's more nuance beneath that. So you've wrote that quite often these are people that have been successful in their own coaching journey, and or they've perhaps had mentorship within coaching that they've found really effective for their own development, and there's therefore a sort of social responsibility towards wanting to sort of pass that on to the next generation. When I was reading that, I was like, yeah, I mean that for me, I mean, as a coach developer myself, like, I mean, there's a handful of people that I say have had a really meaningful impacts on me, but it is often being helped. It makes you want to help other people. Is that something that is there more diversity outside of that? I'm assuming there's going to be loads of reasons why people do anything, I suppose. So, but that does seem to be one thing you've picked up on this. Is that correct?
Well, there's one interesting thing to look at there, which is potentially those who are participants in this research are more likely to be those who are, well, open to it, right? Obviously.
Yeah.
So in terms of the character of who those people are, they're more likely to take an appreciative stance on, why they became a coach developer and why they're doing it, and they potentially had more positive experiences. What I'm saying is that it's likely that there are coach developers out there who could be involved in this type of research who, aren't having such a great time of it and would have some more difficult things to say, or maybe their motivations, and I can certainly speak to this, for becoming a coach developer is slightly more towards the line of, actually, I think my experience was pretty poor and I could potentially do it better. Right. And there's obviously an ego thing that goes involved in that. I think that that's something that's just natural. And then when you start the role, you're like, oh, okay, now, I mean, almost akin to becoming a parent. I'm not a parent myself, but, that adage of you'll understand why your parents did certain things when you have a kid yourself. Maybe there are certain things that we understand when we become a coach developer about our coach developers when we ourselves have to deal with the problems that we face.
Is there perhaps a third personality there too? Because I wonder, sometimes the route into coach development and coach management is a corporate ambition, if there's, for lack of a better word, it's also a gateway towards more power, and it can be seen as perhaps, and the reason I say that is a lot of times underlying agendas for why we would do anything can have influence for how we behave in the role and the impact that we can have. And without saying it's all coach developers are all narcissists that are trying to climb the ladder, that's not it. But again, that's another person, I suppose, that can get into these sorts of positions.
Yeah,
for better
and
or worse.
I think it's important to distinguish then a little bit between the different roles that a coach developer has, and that potentially there are needs for slightly different personalities to undertake those different parts of the role. That a more overt or more extrovert over a more introvert, may be more suited to the different parts. So as good as the umbrella term is, I think in terms of providing some clarity, providing some form to conversations, it doesn't quite speak to all of the different characteristics and traits that potentially are needed from a coach developer. in those different settings. So, the skill set that's required for a non-formal setting as a mentor, personal learning coach, whatever you want to call it, versus someone who is a coach educator in a very formal setting and has to deliver in front of 50 coaches, whatever, is obviously very different. And there are some people, I'm sure, who are capable of doing all of that. It's sense for that to be the case, or do we have specialized roles?
Well, that makes me think about the very fact that, in theory, someone who is designing courses or someone who puts out a newsletter around coach development, they are a coach developer. However, the lived reality of how they do their work, they don't require people skills perhaps in the same way that, like you've said, someone who's in front of people, who's, delivering courses, practical courses, and while that person is at the social skills is that well and good, sometimes there's now spaces created within coaching where someone could have extreme knowledge and understanding of if it's theory or otherwise, and they can translate that. But it's more, is that probably that's probably, you can tell me if I'm correct, but I think that's probably less common, where we're able to pick and choose what environments we do our coach development. It seems like for most coach developers, you need to be the assessor, you need to be the social person delivering, you need to be the course designer, you need to be able to also borrow from lots of different ologies, pedagogy, interpersonal skills. And that's hard, isn't it? But then again, there's never really a job spec that says about doing all of those things at once. And I don't know if you can speak to any of this, because that was one of the things that intrigued me. You spoke about role frames and role clarity.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be a challenge now for coach developers.
Absolutely, it is. And some of that is because we haven't come to a more sort of universal understanding as to what a coach developer is, and if we stick with the umbrella term for now, the different aspects of that. So some of the issue is the sort of top-down clarity that could be given to that potentially. I don't know if we would come to those kinds of agreements. But the other is, and certainly, hopefully my research will speak to this, the differences in how your role operates.
I think there was, you'll need to forgive me, I think there was some strange reason there. There was a very slight pause in the recording, but we were chatting there just for that. It was only a very brief thing there about just the need to be reflexive all the time about who's in front of you, what do they need, and what can you give them based on the constraints of where you're at that time and space. And I see that a lot. I mean, where I've worked both in more formal contexts where you're with a group of coaches for 3 2.5 hour blocks, or it might even indeed just be for a single day, and sometimes that can give you the incentive that, where you need to say something, you need to be firm and quite raw with it at the time, and you need to say it there and then, versus, and there's maybe an appreciation that they've probably accepted that feedback's going to come in that way because they've signed up. You mentioned earlier on, when you've got people who'd come to do research, they must have a certain level of open-mindedness. Some coaches, actually I say this, some coaches do come to formal coach education awards hoping to be told feedback, although sometimes they do it as a tick box, and that's a whole other thing that's difficult as well to navigate. But versus, in that sort of, if we think about it in that general way right now, versus if I'm working with people and maybe I'm trying to develop a project at a club, I need to get them on my side, and that's as much about appeasing them as it is about directing them. And you have to, and at what point do you flex, and at what point do you change the relationship within that? You see it happen a lot as well sometimes within even formal badge awards, where it moves from, right, the initial days of getting to know each other, getting to give them a bit of a sort of formative learning experience of kind of taking them through things. And then the closer it gets to assessment, that relationship between coach developer and coach has to change in a weird way, in a way that's really skillful as well and very hard to do. Particularly when you consider that there isn't a lot of training for coach developers. So, and again, I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit, because it seems like coach developer training is almost like the training's expected to be being a coach. But it's a different thing. It's the same argument that would apply that coaching is different from playing. Coach development is different from coaching. And I wonder if we're doing a disservice that there still seems to be a too much assumption about what the strengths of just a good coaching career can bring for that transition into coach development, because you're doing a different role. Like, I would quite confidently say I'm a better coach developer than I am a coach, which sounds weird, but I would say that because I do it more and I've built a knowledge base on that, and I understand the differences of what I'm doing between actually taking players and taking adults and coaches and talking to them. But we're not always afforded the luxury of having that space and time to learn that skill set, or even having the opportunity to do so, or even knowing where you can find out where you can get that sort of knowledge, because everything's about the practitioner. But a coach developer is a different type of thing. It's a funny issue.
Yeah, it is, and interestingly, with some of the looks in research around training for the coach developer, there's a almost amusing set of lines around this. Okay, we're moving towards learner-centered teaching practices, so we're going to train coach developers in these learner-centered teaching strategies. But then the coach developers that were in the research as participants reporting back that they're not experiencing being taught learner-centered teaching strategies in a learner-centered way. So there's this irony going on of, you're telling me that I need to take on an approach that is more non-linear and long-term thinking and so on. And we did that in a 4-hour seminar where you've taught me that stuff and now I have to go away and deliver it. It's that kind of, irony of that. So there's certainly some reasons to be cheerful, though, it seems, at least as far as the research is concerned, that there are other training programs that seem to be, more successful. They are more long-term. They are more contextually driven in terms of the problems that coach developers are experiencing. Bring that to the table, work with that in a more reflective way. How do we develop our skill set that way? And more importantly, and all of the coach developers, it seems, speak to this, the importance of having a family of coach developers to speak to. And there's various governing bodies who are trying to provide that by, having online meeting spaces, being able to talk about other things. But certainly, it seems in the systematic review and then with the research that I'm doing, that they place quite high importance on that, of being able to talk about their professional role in a meaningful but loyal manner, as in, not with fear of, speaking about the various problems or professional issues they might be having, and how important that is. On a personal level, I can speak to how important it's been for me here to do this job with a colleague who is a great friend of mine, but also someone that I've worked with a number of times, and being able to speak so honestly about our delivery has been massively important to my motivation for the role and for my learning during my role here.
But do you think that's something that everyone's afforded because that's such a great relationship to have? But if we're again thinking about what's perhaps stopping coach developers from being as effective as they could be, they are in a micro-political space, where they are trying to maintain status at the same time as development. And that's even harder, I suppose, when you're seen literally in your job title to be a developer. And it's almost like a dirty word to say that you're developing yourself as a developer.
Right.
And that's that weird tension there. I think I would certainly, I think a lot of governing bodies and they do a good job probably of and actually, again, maybe we don't constrain this to just about talking about it in a formal coach development space, but even on the ground within clubs and within staff bases, I think people do better jobs than what we give them credit for in terms of creating safe spaces and those sorts of things. It doesn't necessarily mean, however, that we aren't still undermining where that safe space and opportunity to be vulnerable, where it can actually go when when afterwards they still are expected to deliver in a way that is maybe counterproductive to that. You mentioned about the idea of learner-centered approaches to pedagogy, and it's all the rave. We all get told to do it as a coach developer. You won't be a coach developer until someone tells you to be learner-centered. But then at the same time, you have to deliver a very standardized, very thought out, and again, I don't say this for reasons that this is bad. It's just that sometimes the two don't go well together. You're often told if you've even been given any guidance, then you're regardless of that, you're told to deliver something that is quite standardized, something that is time constrained often, something that again is done with in front of people who at all times are judging you, and you have to maintain still a certain level of credibility. And this is all just a recipe in a lot of ways for us to fall back on the things that are extremely transactional, extremely removed from the learner, where there's safety for the coach developer, where there's safety for the learner, because again, this is another thing I think, and it's maybe worth just chatting about, is that I think a lot of coaches say they want to develop, but then when they're actually made to maybe think differently about their practice, you're still needing to break down a bit of ego within that, and it's often too much about winning an argument than having a sort of critical discourse about what we do. And again, if it's not that the coach developer has to navigate the policy based stuff that's really constraining their approach to learner centered teaching, they're actually also needing to navigate the big blockade that sometimes coach learners put up themselves. And it's like, how do you do this? This is hard. That is tough, and I think I've experienced that myself. It's a hard thing to do.
It is, and I think at the moment we, as coach developers, essentially learn on the job. But that is the main source of our own development within the role, and so it's a little hit and miss in that respect. And I again spoke to the importance of being able to reflect, have a good reflective practice, connect with others to speak about it. Having these interviews as part of my research has been, almost cathartic at times for myself, to hear these perceived experts in this space, speak to some of the problems they've had, and me be able to go, well, yeah, I've had the same problem,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just so interesting to hear them speak about it in their own context, in their own terms. So it's not that there isn't room for some formal training. Personally, I think that we have a lot to learn from the helping professions, potentially from teacher development. At the moment, I'm very interested in something called the skilled helper, which is a format of the helping profession. They focus very much on opportunity development and problem management, and mostly both. But I love this idea of perceiving ourselves as coach developers as skilled helpers. That we are someone who is in front of a coach learner, and we are there to skillfully help them develop their own professional standards, professional values, professional abilities. And it's really helped in terms of my personal professional life to read through that as an idea of, okay, well, when are the times that we can find challenge points? How do we challenge? This is directly from another book, but the courage to be disliked, that it's okay to do that, right? But as we spoke before, the knowledge that I either have to have a reciprocal relationship with this person or not, and something that I find very difficult because I definitely have the need to be liked. It's something I'm very aware of myself, is that sometimes I have come away from, in the past, situations where I should have challenged, and I chose not to, for, I guess, the fear of being disliked. And then I've come up with some contrived way to revisit that at a later time, when the immediacy of dealing with that issue right then and there, because it's more appropriate, it's more as difficult as it is to have that disjuncture, right? Or that deconstruction. it's necessary. And I mean, one of the coach developers on my research spoke about a moment where they were working with someone and they just sidled up to them and said, "I can't tell if you're a good coach or if you just have good athletes." Wow, what a grenade to throw in, and then just kind of leave them to wrestle with it. But they also spoke about, a month, 2 months later, revisiting with that person and having them say, how useful it was to have to sit in that really uncomfortable place. And I think that is something that we have to be then comfortable with, is for adult learning. How often are we able to put adult learners in uncomfortable situations that then they have the contextual ability to go and deal with, either with our support or not, because that is likely to be the things that they learn the most from. Big issue for the coach developer is then, do they have the agency to do it? Do they have the autonomy to do it? And are they supported by the context, both literally in terms of hierarchy, but sort of figuratively in terms of what that social environment looks like, to then help that coach learner reconstruct their learning later on?
Yeah, no, and I love that word that you make. I think that's, for me, is the idea of courage, because particularly when it's an adult to another adult, which more often than not it is, you do get younger and younger coaches now, and some of them, it's amazing, even teenage boys and girls, what they're doing now, and try to be brave enough to do that. But it's so true, and every coach will say the same, that they grew most when they were most uncomfortable. Now, I think we're also in a space that if you went back 30 years or so, I'm not able to say this firsthand, but certainly other people have told me this, that have been in there a bit longer than me. It used to be brutal. Seemingly, the stories that I've heard, that coach development used to be brutal in the way that people would be fitted back on their practice. And I get why. I think it's still a healthier environment, culture, probably, if it's a better word, that we're in, where we are a bit more careful about how we approach these situations. Just because coaches were dead insecure, are massively insecure people, as much as we come across like we're not. I've sat there, I've been the recipient of this, where, if I've been doing normally in a accredited course, a coaching badge or whatever, where someone's told you, look, this isn't good, it's not good. And you straight away will be defensive. And you know what? In the moment, you'll be like, you switch off to them. But in the car ride home or the week after, you'll make the change that they said sometimes, and you'll be like, yeah, I needed to do that. That was, and it's like, in the moment, the coach developer won't always know that they're really doing good for the person, because in the moment all they'll see is the emotions and the defensiveness and the stuff that we don't want to experience. The coach would, I'm sure everyone would rather go up to see someone and say, that session was fantastic, that was what a great session. But then you're doing a disservice, and in a way you're a hypocrite, I think, when we tell candidates on courses about the importance of working and getting each other's feedback. If you're not also putting yourself in there to disrupt their schema and be part of that reconstruction of what they know, then and oftentimes it's by doing something that and saying something that is, playing devil's advocate at the very least, that is trying to disrupt that, as I say, you're doing a disservice to them. But that is still a hard thing. That's a hard space to get into. And then you mentioned as well, and this comes back to get another thing as coaches or coach developers, we need to be good at, is how do we support other coaches' autonomy? Because if we want this to be learner-centered, but we're always telling them what to do and we're always directing them, how are we expecting them, when they're outside of our company, to actually take their development into their own hands? And again, that's perhaps where there's space. And I would say, again, this goes across just in a formal coach development circle, where it's in a badge, an NGB, to even inside a club, or where it's that sort of personal learning friend, critical friend, whatever you want to call it. How are we actually, as coaches, supporting the athlete, or supporting the coach who works with the athlete to support themselves? And that again is a hard thing. It takes relationship building. And that's real bottoms up coaching. But I don't think at the moment we're really taught how to do bottoms up coach development. I think it's still, if it's not explicit and that here's the script, here's the material you need to work through, it's implicit in that they either expect of you to be that person that tells them what to do, or you feel the need to be that person that tells them what to do. And this is, how do we get to that point then?
And that's even more key, I think. You know, a skilled coach developer is able to get past, I think, those issues of, you know, a coach learner, you know, just wanting them to be the expert and tell them what to do. You know, there's various different ways in which then that coach developing can be like, well, no, I'm not going to do that for you, and here's why. You know, there's various ways, I think, to do that then are personal to each person. More importantly, I think you touched on it there, of that I feel like I have to, you know, do some of this top-down approach and enact some of this policy, even when there are, you know, other contexts that allow for a slightly longer-term relationship. The classic problem here is, how do we prove as coach developers our own effectiveness? Especially given, as you just described, that learning, so to speak, or that development for that coach learner could happen years later in a completely different context, long after that relationship is complete. Whether that was, you know, a 2-year engagement, a 6-week engagement, whatever it might look like. So how do we as coach developers then form this evidence base of what we do that we know in our hearts is effective, but we can't necessarily point to certain stats and say, well, this is how that's happened? And there are definitely tensions between those who sit in administrative positions, perhaps hierarchical positions, who then have a coach developer who is working immersively with coach learners in a particular setting, and for various reasons needs proof that this is working, beyond the coaches themselves just going, yeah, great bloke, love working with him, it's wonderful, you know, because that isn't enough to stay, and actually possibly would be an indication that it isn't being effective, right? I suppose it's more likely that the coaches would be like, yeah, he's a right nuisance, I'd rather he wasn't here sometimes. So it's how to navigate that, I think, is a big problem for us to figure out. How do we help coach developers do the job that they think they need to do in order to be the most effective long term for the development of the coach learner in front of them, prove to those who are in influential positions and possibly even finance those positions that there is effectiveness going on, there is effective development happening. And so education of those people who employ coach developers is just as necessary.
Yeah, to help them understand, I suppose, in a more ecological sense, how what they do impacts what the coach developers do, and that in turn it impacts the relationships they have with those in their charge. Because one of the things that I think you brought out as well through the systematic review is where if there's a discrepancy between what the policy states and perhaps the wider string pullers, in what way they're pushing a coach developer to take their work, either there could be confusion over what to deliver, or else resistance to it. And then again, if we think about across a wider pool of coach developers, there's then inconsistency. But then it's like, we don't want consistency, because coach learners aren't consistent. We're talking about their journeys non-linear. So, and if we want to be bottoms up and we want to cater to their individual needs, we shouldn't have, in theory, then maybe we shouldn't have a consistent delivery plan. But then at the moment, I see a lot of delivery plans that going off plan is more the possibility as opposed to the intention. I wonder, are we getting things around the wrong way? I don't know. It's just my opinion.
There's not the space for a coach developer, it seems, within a formal program. I'm sure there are some formal programs somewhere where that's the possibility, right? But it doesn't seem like there is the space for a coach developer on a formal program to address the somatic data that they might be experiencing in order to produce an environment where learning can take place. So, for example, I was delivering for a football national governing body, and I became very aware that there were a group of coaches on this course who weren't having me. They didn't believe in what I was saying. They weren't really having the course. They didn't really think they needed to be there. So no learning is taking place, obviously. So I concocted a way of delivering content that would expose the lack of knowledge in the room to allow me to then deliver in a way that would be effective. This was around physical development. I had the coaches in the room write down literally everything they can think of as far as what a professional footballer might have to have as a physical competency. They obviously came up with hundreds, right? Some were useful, some very much not so. And this particular group of coaches on one particular table were very happy with themselves that they won the game that I'd concocted because they came up with the most things. I followed that up with the question of, okay, if we agree that all of these things are important for the development of a potential professional footballer, how do we develop those in our young players? And the tumbleweeds that went through the classroom is exactly what I was hoping for, what I expected, and thankfully is what happened. And I've used that technique a number of different times across my career since. What it allowed me to do was to say, okay, we need a better way of thinking about this, a slightly easier way of thinking about this. Here's the ABCs. How do we put those into sessions? Now, after 20 minutes of this fabricated moment, now I get to deliver the detail in a more effective way. Was that on a curriculum or a policy? Absolutely not. If the person who was overseeing me as a new coach developer in that role had seen me deliver in that way, I think there's a strong chance that they would have had strong words with me. They wouldn't have been happy, I think, because I'm going off script and I'm not delivering the way that I was told to, etc. So there's a problem, obviously, with the policy, but there's also this, you've almost got to have a conviction, I think, then as a coach developer of like, no, I am experiencing this environment as being not conducive to coach development. What am I going to do about it to produce a environment and system that is going to be more conducive to that? And then, as we've spoken about before, how much of a reciprocal relationship do I have to have with these people? And that's going to impact, the sort of temporal nature of what I do with it.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's a great example of how you can break that down, that sort of difficult customer. It makes me also consider perhaps as another strategy too. I've seen where it can be useful at times with your initial conversations, and I suppose this is where it's really key in the first moments that if you're working with someone more episodically, or again, probably across even a larger space of time, even just setting the parameters of what the relationship's going to look like, so that they appreciate that when you say something, always never been told by a really great coach educator at the SFA, Richie Wilson, and used to say about it's professional, not personal. And I always take that with me, and I always think when I'm speaking to coaches, about when we're trying to feed back on them about understanding that as a starting point, and that's sort of like just part of coach education. I don't think it is around necessarily the procedural knowledge of the job. Part of it's about opening them up to learning, and I think that's maybe another role that the coach developer has to remember now, is that we are trying to cultivate a space where lifelong learning is part of the journey and part of the ambition of coaches, and not just to accrue further sport-specific knowledge, but to accrue a mentality towards knowledge. And I think that's always been it's always a useful starting point for me. But even then, even even more broadly, setting with the parameters of, I may say things at times that again is based on, we have an agreement, you want to get better, I'm going to disrupt how you think at times. I'm going to say things at times that is about making you less comfortable. And then if they understand that, then it's not as big a surprise then when you come in and you speak to them. So yeah, we can see a lot of different things in there.
And that's key. That's key, I think, in any coach development relationship. And it's certainly come up from, my research so far, is this idea of contracting, whether that is just like a verbal agreement or whether it's literally a contract written down and signed. It's the ability to come back to that and say, we agreed within this environment that this is how we were going to be. Are we doing that right now? Not really. Well, do we need to adjust this contract then so that it more appropriately reflects what you want it to be? Or, do I need to challenge you that you're not operating in a way that is going to be, again, conducive to us having an appropriate and effective coach development relationship? Especially the one-to-one. And we've spoken a lot about the formal coach education environment now, but my actual research with the PhD is more about the one-to-one relationship and about how that works. And so this idea of contracting, which had come up with literally everyone, they pointed to it as just so important so that the relationship has this framing that they can operate within, but also come to an understanding early on, potentially, that I'm not for you. In this idea that it has to be them to us. It's not going to work in any other way. It can't be us to them. So if during that initial contracting section, there's so much incongruence between me and you as a coach learner, no problem. Maybe I'm not for you.
I know.
And so the policy part of that is, are we able to, as governing bodies, sport organizations, whoever else, to afford the space for coach developers and coach learners to come to that agreement and have that be okay? I think that a lot of coach developers, unfortunately, are in situations where they are either feel or are told explicitly, I have to get on with everyone and I have to develop everyone. Not only that, but also the same amount. and there's clearly an issue with that, clearly. But sometimes it seems that the context dictates that that's the situation they end up feeling themselves in.
Yeah. And I suppose it will depend, and again, I suppose we can move the conversation towards more on the ground work that again might be informal, and again, we know that's where coach development takes place also. You'd mentioned a little bit about flattening the hierarchy earlier on. I'm curious if you can clarify what you mean by that, because I've been thinking a little bit around the structuring of coaching teams. Sometimes we have very set traditional hierarchies where, let's say across an academy, there can be a head coach at each age group and an assistant coach. There are also academies that, for very good reasons as well, have what I would term a flat hierarchy. And again, forgive me if I've taken this in the wrong way. It's just got me thinking about these things, where it's coaching partners and there is no head coach. So you've got two people that have to kind of work together and coexist. But I always wonder I think there's good stuff around hierarchy. I don't think hierarchy is this. It's very popular to say we need to get rid of hierarchy. I don't mean it in any sort of societal terms or anything like that. I mean in terms of sometimes pairing better coaches with coaches that need to get better. It's just a very effective way of doing things. And sometimes having title-based roles, by just the very fact of the title itself, aligns itself to an openness for the person who needs to learn more, just because they see things differently. And I just wonder, and again, tell me, this is probably the point you tell me that wasn't it to do what you were talking about, but it's making me think about, again, inside a club environment, about how the structures of things can help with informal learning, or they might go against it, because sometimes if we make coaches think that they're closer than what they are, we can actually lose the opportunity for a coach who has got more experience and would love to be able to help a coach with less. They might start to feel as if they're crossing a boundary just by the fact that they're on the same level technically, but it's anything but in reality, and that's a tough thing.
Yeah. Okay.
But it can also help. It can help as well, because it also will force in flat hierarchies, and that way it can help because it can force people to take on responsibility for each other and to help with each other and create a space where, look, you can learn as much from me as I can give to you, and you can give to me, sorry. So there's pros and cons to a lot of this stuff. We're now thinking about how you actually structure environments where coaches support one another.
I speak to both environments. So I suppose that flattening of hierarchy, I guess I was referring mostly to that kind of one-to-one relationship. Again, whether you call that mentoring, personal learning coach, whatever. But if I'm regularly just meeting with you, then it's not really that useful for you to see me as a performance manager. And this is a problem that, I've experienced personally in a number of different contexts, but I know that I'm certainly not unique in this respect. That if that person sees me as a manager of their performance, because I'm immersed in this role, we both work for the same company, and they might think that I'm here to tell them all the different things that they're doing wrong, and even potentially to feed that back to their actual manager, then the relationship's a non-starter. It's not going to go anywhere. Perhaps then in a formal situation, we might need to navigate hierarchy rather than flatten it. That I'm aware that I have this moniker of being a coach educator or coach developer, and therefore I'm presenting myself as somewhat an expert. I have to be. I have to have, a significant knowledge base for those people in front of me. But that I need to navigate that hierarchy so that they engage with their own learning rather than just accept what I'm saying and reproduce that on the field. And that it's certainly within football is a consistent problem, I think, that largely speaking, especially those who are kind of earlier on in their coaching careers, and I would have been the same, largely what we want is tell me what to do and give me some ideas of how to do it so that I can go and do that tonight with my teams. It's natural. At the same time, then we want to move them from that sort of naive knowledge position of I'm just reproducing what's been shown to me to a more sophisticated position. But actually just reproducing something initially, so long as there is proper reflection, might be a good way to go. It's such a hard balance to strike.
Yeah,
so,
and I completely agree. I think new coaches, if we're just looking at it in very classic ways, a new coach just wants a recipe, but a more developed coach wants to know how they actually made that. So I suppose that's a conversation between sort of more procedural knowledge, where it's understanding that the coach developer, they want to know how to do something, and it's not to suggest that how to is easier than why, but how to does have sometimes to be more accessible than understanding why. We can teach coaches how to do game-based learning before we teach them why game-based learning creates a motor program that is more adaptable, that helps, with self-organization and movement, with these sorts of things, so that they're getting, and I suppose it's the job of the coach developer to scaffold that and how they do it without necessarily patronising the person they're working with. And again, I think sometimes we can actually, and this maybe comes back to when we're trying to speak to a louder and a bigger audience than one-to-one, because we have to make assumptions. The more people we coach at the one time, we need to make more assumptions about what they can't do. Whereas I think sometimes a coach development environment is one where sometimes a little bit of overload can be great, or not even overload, but just, give the coaches curiosity and focus on that. And they can take that more procedural knowledge and take it to the next level quicker than you might think they would otherwise. And I think, again, that comes to, we want to scaffold things, but we don't want to, as I say, limit their learning potential outside of the time with us, so they're not reliant on us by sometimes withholding information or withholding things until they're at the next level. And we see this, I think, a lot of times in more formal coach education, where level 2 you learn this, level 3 you learn that. And I'm like, we live in an information space now. Digitally, we have never had more access to information than what we can. There should be I think that there's a space, and again, it needs to be managed, and it's like everything. I think the main theme that's coming out of this conversation is about tension. It needs to be managed, but there's probably is a space of, right, here's how to do this as you're still learning. But do you know what? Here's the resources to find out about why, and you can choose to go on to that now if you like, or you can wait until we look at it closer together in time. But knowing why is really important. If you don't know why, you'll never be able to innovate. And again, we're talking about how can we avoid reproduction. And I think one of the key things that a coach developer can do to avoid reproduction is avoid only showing how. Because you only show how, they only have a recipe that they follow. And that recipe is not allowing them to know, they know how to make an omelette, but they don't know how to use eggs to make another meal. In the simplest analogy I can give,
I love that.
that's what you're asking a coach to do, and that's that whole, because what I really enjoyed learning about through your work, Tim, was that idea of reproduction. It's so hard to avoid, but maybe we do a disservice because we limit what we think we should give them because we go, oh, they're only at this stage. I don't know. What do you think around any of that?
Yeah, massive question. It's challenging because you can intentionally be using learner-centered strategies, for example, reflective practice, and set it up in a way that then becomes reproduction again. So like one of the papers that in the systematic review that was talking about the issues of sort of confession, that if reflective practice just becomes confession because sat round in a classroom and the coach developer has asked, anyone willing to share, some of the problems that they've had because they didn't do something in a certain way, the temptation for the coach learner becomes, well, I'd better confess to something, even if it's not quite what happened, so that I am seen as learning, or I am seen maybe even as compliant. I think that's less likely, but more in terms of that I'm seen to be actively involved in my own development. But being able to step away from it and not being within that environment is quite easy to point to and go, well, that potentially isn't the right way to deliver that. But as you say, for especially anyone who is experiencing something as novel, because they are novice in that way, needs a stronger framing around of that particular thing. I often refer back to inquiry-based learning, an IBL framework, where if it's a novel thing, going from true inquiry all the way through to open inquiry, sorry, that's not quite right, closed inquiry through to open or true inquiry, if it is novel to them, it probably has to be more closed. We have to give more direction, and this would transfer through to coaching as well. Now that there's a sufficient amount of understanding, that there's enough catalyst, now it can become more broader and more wider as an inquiry, and perhaps more problem-based, because there's enough there for them to point towards and start working with, and as you said, kind of creatively work with, to find their own solutions and find their own learning to it. So it's skillfully understanding when to interject, when to give direction, and when to neglect. And actually, I noticed that you're experiencing this problem, but I think you have enough to be able to just wrestle with it and maybe get there with some support. So I'm actually going to neglect telling you anything right now. I think the problem has been over a longer period of time, both with coaching and coach development. I'm making a huge statement here. Hopefully don't get too short.
Why not? How on earth would you get better if we don't say things?
of, swinging from one side to the other of like, very directive coach education all the way over to, well, I'm going to effectively let the game be the teacher, right? That was the sort of phrase of it.
Mm.
The problem being that, like with learner-centered teaching strategies, is there enough expertise and understanding of how those strategies work to actually put them in place? Or are we putting them in place with, not enough knowledge, and they kind of fall flat? There was one of the papers that was really well written, and really thankful they did so, because it was confession effectively of a program that they had put together that was online and in person, I think, that sought to employ learner-centered teaching strategies. And it didn't work because the learners themselves didn't know how to engage with that. But the learning there is, for us as coach developers, maybe we have to contract at the beginning in a particular way and deliver something at the beginning around, this is what our learning is going to look like, how it's going to be delivered, and what would be expected of you. What do you think? Do you agree with that? Do you want to engage in that way? If not, maybe this isn't for you. So again, and do we have that freedom to be able to say, it's okay if this particular way of being isn't quite what you're looking for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, it's I think that's a great way of just continuing to term this, is contracting. That it's that whole argument that we need that old argument of we always need to give autonomy. That's, again, it's one thing to say that, but sometimes respecting someone's autonomy, it can just mean asking them, do you want me to take the lead? Are you in a space right now where you want that kind of relationship? And if they consent to that, then that's autonomy, and you can be a highly directive, autonomy supportive coach developer, because there's contracting's there.
I
Is there
agree.
nuance?
I agree. However, there are situations then where, you might say to someone, do you want me to step in and deliver this bit? And they go, yeah, sure. And you don't quite pick up that actually they just feel like
is it authentic?
You stepped on their toes or whatever. So again, it's this balance of being able to pick up situational context and somatic data in front of you. Is that actually going to be helpful for that person or not? In that contracting stage, you might say something of, maybe you'd like me to step in from time to time. And they go, yeah, I guess. That's probably not then, right? So maybe we need to take that out of the contracting, because again, they don't quite know yet what that might look like, how that might feel for them, whether they feel like you're just stepping on their toes then. So
what I'm thinking then, Tim, then is that the point you're making, it makes me now think about the skill set that an effective coach developer needs. While you're talking about the need to sort of, on a one-to-one basis, understand psychology in some way and how you can create and motivate participants, there's a social element to this. This is a social intelligence of being able to read what's beneath what they say, to know where not to interject. And it makes me wonder again, are we preparing coach developers for that skill set? Because it's not something everyone's got a natural inclination towards being able to do. Actually, not even inclination, it's not a natural disposition to be able to do that, or indeed actually we don't always have the motivation to do that, because we're so caught up in coach development and as coaches, in the same way that we just need to keep learning more about the sport. But this isn't about the sport, this is about people, and this is about, and again, are we getting enough training on this then? Because that's lacking. That's not going to be there for everyone.
It's a person who happens to coach a sport that you're working with, and it speaks to recruitment and retention. If we come to an understanding that there is a certain set of characteristics that would make an effective coach developer, do we recruit for those characteristics, or do we seek out someone who has professional knowledge,
license,
or whatever that professional knowledge looks like, and then train them for whatever is quote unquote missing, right? And that comes up with all kinds of other problems, obviously, but missing certain qualities. Which way is going to be more effective? You know, do we recruit for it or do we train for it? This now aspect of, you know, understanding that this is a social enterprise, a social endeavor in terms of being a coach, an effective coach developer.
But I like that wider philosophy, and it depends on how you actually perceive what you're saying, because I'm thinking of that as a strength-based approach. But then obviously it starts from that point, but then you need to correct something again, so it takes you back into that avenue. But it is a strength-based. What can you do? Let's not focus on what you can't do. What can you do? And some of your work's now looked around that idea of a priest of inquiry, and even from a coach to coach developer to coach learner, what can you do? And let's focus on that. And, you know.
And then for the coach learner, does it become a network? So, you know, some of Tom Leader's work around, you know, that was mentoring specific, but creating a multiple mentor network. Thinking about my role here, you know, my colleague has a skill set that is somewhat overlapping with mine, and in other areas is very much not. We have strength areas that are different. Okay, let's use that. You know, so therefore, when we're talking about, you know, our next delivery or how the network and system is being built, what parts are, you know, going to be driven by you, what parts are going to be driven by me, and actually where are some places where you're going to lead it in the knowledge that the support from the other person is actually going to be more successful as well. So there are, you know, there are situations where me working with that colleague, my support in that moment is going to be stronger for the learning of the coach learners than me leading it, and vice versa. You know, even though potentially with that topic on paper, I might be the more expert. So thinking reflexively in that respect. So again, the coach developers I've spoken to with my research, they are so aware of where their resources, their personal resources start and end, and where they can resource others, or at least signpost to others, to fill gaps that they've seen. And that is then the key skill of that coach developer, that they can see where those gaps are to make sure that the entire system around that learner is effective as it can be. It's not just about me as the coach developer then, it's about, well, where does this person sit in that system?
Yeah, no, you put it so well. So no, what I've been just noting down there, Tim, is I'm trying to take a lot of notes at the moment about some of the main things that came across there. And for those that are trying to, you know, because we're probably scattering people's minds in so many ways, because it's such a complicated role.
Well, but maybe I can summarize a little bit. You know, I think some of the major things that come up, you know, how do we get to a place where it's them to us? What are the different ways in which I might do that? How can I be situationally aware enough that I know where I sit in this system of that coach learner? And, you know, some people will be aware of, I'm sure, about the athlete talent development environment and kind of what that model looks like of athlete in the middle, and then that wider environment that athlete experiences. We can think of the coach in the same way, that they're right in the middle, and then there's all these things around it. And the coach developer is going to be sitting within that system, but more importantly, looking out and looking in to see where that system is, and then potentially even, you know, manipulating it. So then to us, situational awareness, and then that contracting, that starting position of, are we clear as to what this is and what this isn't? You spoke before about, you know, moving from transformational leadership across to transactional leadership, because at some point I might be assessing you. And so I'm going to make you aware that, look, on those days, I can't be the same. And that's similar to, we've got tryouts coming up for, you know, the young players I work with here. I've already said to them, be aware that on the day of tryouts, I can't be exactly as I am as your coach. I'll be as close to it as I can, but I can't be exactly like that, because new families coming in, new players, they don't want to feel like, you know, there's already too much of a bias. Perhaps a useful anecdote on that. But those three things have come up time and time again already.
Yeah. And what I see beneath that as well, because I've written down contracting, setting that relationship, setting the boundaries, and then through that we can explore things together. They need to think reflexively, so you're in different spaces with different people at different times. You've touched on that. And then what sits alongside that, what I've gathered, is the social intelligence to be able to know when is what they're saying different to what they're showing. You know, in terms of body language, how you speak to them, when do you interject, when's it better to sit off. But again, we need to balance this. We learn our wants versus learn our needs. We have to be courageous. I think that's another word that, for those that are listening, I think is a way of solving some of these problems. There's courage in knowing what your longer term aim is with that person, and it isn't always about helping them feel good now. It's about making them better longer term. And also, I think there's a bit of a call now for the structures that surround the coach developer to actually assist with their role. Firstly, clarify the role, but assist with it by giving them a platform where, from the policy that they're being told to enact, to who's in front of them, to how they're maybe assessed and rewarded perhaps in the role, that we're actually, and how they're trained in the role as well, that we're actually allowing for a space where things like learner-centered practice can happen, and not just a power game and not just the reproduction of what we already know. Because again, if we've got systems in place where we want you to be creative, but if you don't fulfill this wee thing in the bots, you'll need to come back. We don't need that perhaps in a culture. We need standardization, but we need flexibility for the person that's delivering an app. And again, this comes down to, what do we care about as organisations that are responsible for coach development, either as NGBs or a club, or even indeed people who work in partners? What do we actually care about? Is it metrics, or is it development? And that isn't always the same thing. So I think it's an excellent conversation. It's got me thinking a lot. Tim, I've taken up enough of your time, I think. So thanks so much for coming on and sharing that. It's honestly been a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to kind of put those thoughts together. It's certainly helpful for me. I've taken some notes as well, and go away and kind of try to reflect further on it, keep getting some clarity. And we've got a long way to go with this space. So starting these conversations, and if there's some things that come from this, then all for the better. Thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, and for anyone that's interested in reading Tim's systematic review, it's titled "The Face of Coach Development: A Systematic Review of the Role of the Coach Developer." You can find that in the International Sports Coaching Journal, and I think it's open access as well, even better, for those that want to dig deeper and follow the work that Tim's now starting. Thanks again, Tim, so much, and hopefully that has been as useful for the listeners as it has been for me. So we'll see you next time.